Thanksgiving break. Unfortunately, I just tested positive for COVID tonight, so I'm not quite sure what the plan will look like the rest of this week. But obviously, you have a sub today, so I'm going to just go ahead and record the lecture for today. So on Friday, we just did these two slides. So remember, we just talked a little bit about the endocrine system, and then we talked about different types of nervous tissue as well as glial cells, which are these right here. So just make sure you have those terms down. But remember, only 10% of this nervous tissue is going to be, or 90% of this tissue is glial cells, and the other 10% is going to be neurons, which we are going to talk about for today. So this should pick back up with your notes, so go ahead and just follow along with that. So for the neuron structure, this is going to be a really important structure that you are going to be seeing a lot for the rest of this unit, as well as for your final as well. This is going to be something important to know. So there's going to be a few main terms that you're going to know here when it comes to neurons. First is going to be the soma, which is also called the cell body. That is this kind of oval structure right there. That is basically the life support that contains the nucleus and a lot of the other really important organelles that neurons rely on. Example of that would be mitochondria. So we saw this with our muscle cells as well, which again, in the mitochondria, we should all know by now that that is where cellular respiration occurs. So ATP is going to be produced, which is really important because neurons have a really high metabolic rate, so they require a lot of energy. They're pretty much needing a constant supply of glucose and oxygen. So actually about 25% of our daily food intake is what goes to the activity of our neurons. So that's why super important they have mitochondria there. You can see the nucleus is in the center on that diagram. Next super important term that you're going to need to know is going to be the processes, which these are extensions from this main cell body right here. So we have two main processes to talk about. The first is going to be the dendrites. Those look like these little tentacles or roots coming off of the cell body. Those are going to be the main receptor of signals. So we can call that the input region as well. So that's where the signals are going into. So it's called the input region. The other main feature that we have coming off the cell body is going to be the axon, which is this whole structure right here. This is going to be what actually generates and transmit the nerve impulses. Because of that, it can also be known as the conducting region, or it can be known as a nerve fiber. So three kind of names for that. It can be called axon, conducting region, or nerve fiber. So three terms for one item. And so you can see here it says the direction of the nerve impulse. So it's going to start up by the soma, come off the dendrites, and go down the axon. As you go down the axon, you'll see we have a few more terms down here that we're going to talk about a little bit on the next slide. But you also need to know that these terms right here. So nerves are just going to be bundles of axons, which are going to extend from the brain and the spinal cord to the rest of the body. And then we have ganglions, which are going to be collections of nerve cell bodies. So collections of these somas right here that are located throughout the body, so not just in the brain or spinal cord. So a few other terms right there. Neurons are super important because they are going to be some of your oldest cells in your body. They can actually last your entire lifetime if they are taken care of. So they're pretty much irreplaceable. They are unable, if they're damaged, it's unable to regenerate. So we saw with bone cells, when you have a fracture, something like that, your bone cells are able to regenerate. That is not able to happen when it comes to neurons. So if one is damaged, it's going to be damaged for good. So yes, super important cells. All right, so a few more terms when it comes to the neuron structure. First is going to be the axon terminal. This is going to be the end of the axon that releases neurotransmitters at a synapse when a nerve impulse is received. This can also be called the secretory region. So you can see that our axon terminals, they look like these little plungers or kind of suction cups down here. We also have something called the myelin sheath, which you can see along the axon. That is what looks like those little pills. Those are going to cover the axons, which again, those can be called nerve fibers. And the myelin sheath is super important because it's going to protect and insulate the axons. And because of that, it actually is going to increase the speed of the nerve impulse transmission as well. So I would definitely star that. That is super important feature to know of the myelin sheath. We do have unmyelinated gaps, so that's gaps that do not have a myelin sheath. And that is, you can see those little gaps right here in between each of the orange pill looking areas. Those are also going to increase the velocity of the nerve signal conduction. So that is two different ways that we can increase the nerve impulse there. All right, when it comes to classification, so we have a couple different types of classification here. First, they can be classified by their structural differences, which is going to be based on the number of processes or extensions from the cell body. So first, we have multipolar, which is just going to mean that they are going to have more than 3 processes, which is typically 1 axon and 2 or more dendrites. So again, you can see this is like the diagram that we saw in the last 2 slides, and that's because 99% of our neurons are going to be multipolar, which makes sense because neurons are communication cells, so they need a lot of processes for inputting and outputting information. And you can see with the arrows here, that is going to show the direction of the signal transmission. So it's going to go from the dendrites down the axon towards the axon terminals, little plungers down there. So next one we have is going to be a bipolar, which bi just means 2. So this one is going to have 2 processes, which is 1 axon and 1 dendrite, and that's going to be on opposite ends of the cell, as you can see here. These are super rare. They're only found in a few special sense organs, which we're going to be talking more about senses later on this week. But just know, bipolar means 2 processes. Then we have unipolar. This is just going to have 1 process, and it's going to divide from the cell body like a T. So we've got our cell body, and then it divides like a T. This is going to be found in the ganglia, which again, that's just a group of sensory neurons. So it makes a lot of sense that our sensory receptors are going to be unipolar because they are just taking in sensory stimuli and sending that information in one direction. So they're sending it towards the central nervous system to be processed. So that's why it's going in one direction there, even though it kind of breaks off into 2 to look like a T. So 3 different types of structural classifications there. But we also have functional classifications, and that first type of functional classification we have is based on the way an impulse travels. So it can travel through the neuron, and it's going to be important to see how it reacts in terms of the brain and the spine as well. So first we have sensory neurons, which are going to be transmitting information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Most of these are going to be structurally unipolar, which we kind of talked about on the last slide. So you can see with that diagram there, if you touch this little prickly cactus, that's going to generate this response that will go all the way through and creating the response for you to pull your hand back. So that is the sensory neuron part of what's happening. That is just this little section right here. Next, we have motor neurons, which is on the right side of this diagram, so it's right here. These are going to transport information from the central nervous system to the rest of the body. These are usually going to be multipolar because they're going to need to send the impulse to multiple places. So here, it's just going in kind of the opposite direction, as you can see. Last type of functional classification that we have is going to be interneurons, which is just right in the middle, right here. This can also be called an association neuron. These are housed in the central nervous system, and they're going to transport information between the sensory and motor neurons. Because of this, they are going to be multipolar. So those are a few examples. If you kind of remember with the last time we had structural and functional classifications, they typically kind of go hand in hand. So interneurons are typically going to be multipolar. Motor neurons are typically going to be multipolar as well. And then sensory neurons are going to be unipolar. So make sure you know that. Next, you guys are going to work on the inquiry activity in your notes. So this should be in your packet. I believe it starts on page 12. So this is going to talk a lot about neuron structure, the sodium-potassium pump, which we talked about a little bit in Unit 1. So think back all the way to the beginning of the semester. So we talked about this with Unit 1, Concept 2, when we did homeostasis and feedback loops. So if you are confused on anything with the inquiry activity, maybe look back to those notes. But again, this should start on page 12. This is going to be some new information for you guys. So I just want you to try your best, see what you can figure out. I'll go back to the last slide and I would just pause that to make sure you have down the overall structure of a neuron. You're going to need that as well. And then remember, this is talking about a sodium-potassium pump. So you should be working with sodium and potassium ions when it comes to a few of the diagrams there. So if you have questions about it, we're going to go over this in class on Tuesday. So not sure if I'll be back or not and how COVID works, but if not, I'll just keep doing these videos. So yeah, just bear with me and we're gonna make it through this semester. So okay, so here is the neuron structure. So I would just pause this as you're working through your inquiry activity. You're going to need to know that. So you can pause it here, or here are a few other terms if you need to remember those. So I think this one will be more helpful though. So that's what we're going to be working on the rest of class today. When it comes to the test for this unit, we're just going to include that with the final. So you're not going to have a separate test from this unit. We are going to have a project that we're going to start on Thursday, which will be another 100-point project. So that'll be kind of your last chance to get a whole bunch of points in the grade book right before finals. So that's kind of the plan for this week and for the rest of this unit. Yeah, that's all I've got for today. Work on your inquiry activity. If you get finished with that, go ahead and start working on your Concept 1 study guide for this unit. All right, thanks guys.